Well, whenever the question of female leadership comes up in the Bible, one of the first stories to turn to is definitely the story of Deborah, this great righteous judge who led Israel. And alongside her is Jael, the servant girl who wins the day for Israel. And the theological importance of their story links to other parts of Scripture and the grand narrative of what God is doing. Judges 4, 1 through 10, and Judges 5, 6 through 7, 24 through 27. After Ehud had died, the Israelites again did things that the Lord saw as evil. So the Lord gave them over to King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, and he was stationed in Harosheth ha-Goyim. The Israelites cried out to the Lord because Sisera had 900 iron chariots and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. Now, Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidot, was a leader of Israel at that time. She would sit under Deborah's palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the Ephraim highlands, and the Israelites would come to her to settle disputes. She sent word to Barak, Abinoam's son, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "Hasn't the Lord Israel's God issued you a command? Go and assemble at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 men from the people of Naphtali and Zebulun with you. I'll lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, to assemble with his chariots and troops against you at the Kishon River, and then I'll help you overpower him." Barak replied to her, "If you'll go with me, I'll go, but if not, I won't go." Deborah answered, "I'll definitely go with you. However, the path you're taking won't bring honor to you, because the Lord will hand over Sisera to a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. He summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men marched out behind him. Deborah marched out with him too. So then the rest of chapter 4 is the battle itself. And sure enough, one of the servant girls, Jael, lures in the king oppressing the Israelites. And it's this graphic moment where he thinks he has a place to hide, and he lays down his head to rest, and instead she nails a tent peg through his temple. We won't read that part, but the song after the victory is sung by both Barak and Deborah, and there's a few lines in the song that add some commentary to the story. So Judges 5. In the day of Shamgar, Anath's son, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased. Those traveling by road kept to the back roads. Villagers disappeared. They disappeared in Israel until you, Deborah, rose, until you arose as a mother in Israel. And then in verse 24, may Jael be blessed above all women. May the wife of Heber the Kenite be blessed above all tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she provided milk. She presented him cream in a majestic bowl. She reached out her hand for the stake, her strong hand for the worker's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his skull. At her feet he sank, fell, and lay flat. At her feet he sank. He fell where he sank. There he fell, dead. So this is a really famous story, and especially the question that often comes up. We're starting to touch on the idea of women in leadership. And early on in Judges, you have a story. One of the most righteous judges in the whole book of Judges is this woman prophet named Deborah. So she's described as a prophet and a leader or a judge of Israel. The way that the book of Judges works is it starts off kind of at this high moment. So the first couple judges are honorable and righteous, and then it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And most of the judges throughout the whole book are not people that you'd ever want to emulate. You know, Samson is a famous judge. He's down here near the bottom of the pack. But Deborah is right near the beginning, and she's one of the most righteous judges who's fully trusting in the Lord, and she's been appointed as a leader for Israel. There's this interesting moment. Not only it does seem to highlight the gender dynamic going on here, because one, Deborah is obviously leading the people, but then Barak, who has no problem with her being a leader, actually, I find that really interesting when we talk about women leadership today. There's certainly whole swaths, especially of Christianity, that feels like that's a problem. What I would point out, this is one of those stories, there doesn't seem to be an issue with the fact that Deborah is a woman. There's no condemnation or frustration or confusion on that part in particular. You could also say, on a similar, just a little side note, we have some, while rare, we have other instances of female leaders. Probably the most famous on more of a negative side would be Jezebel. She could almost be, she was the wife of Ahab. You can read about her in Kings. But she's almost like the opposite of Deborah. Where Deborah was righteous, Jezebel was incredibly wicked. She was condemned by the Lord. She brought in idol worship to the Baals and to Asherah, and eventually God brought a prophetic rebuke against her, and she was devoured by dogs in the street. But even like Deborah, Jezebel was never condemned or questioned for her sex in particular. So she was condemned as a very wicked leader, but not because she was a woman in leadership, but because she was a wicked leader, period. And Deborah is commended for her righteous leadership. So let's keep going through. Barak has this interesting exchange. He's already apparently been commanded by the Lord. There's this past tense. Didn't God already issue you a command? And so he's already been dragging his feet. And he gets to this point of finally being willing to accept, but he says, okay, here's how I'll do it. If you go with me, I'll go. But if not, I won't. So he's already been given the command. And now he's asking Deborah to come with him. He wants a little extra strength, a little extra encouragement. And Deborah says, that's fine. I'll go with you. But just so you know, God is going to hand over Sisera to a woman. There's no real commentary there. That's kind of an interesting point. Barak doesn't seem, at least in the text, to be upset by that. He says, okay, let's go. He brings 10,000 men. They go. And Jael, the servant, ends up being the hero that day. This song then gives a few more bits of commentary that I also find really interesting. One, it has this great song of praise to Deborah as leading Israel as the mother of Israel. Deborah rose as a mother of Israel in the midst of great darkness and oppression. Villagers were disappearing. The caravans were ceasing. Right? There's so much oppression that trade and the road is no longer safe, and people are disappearing left and right. But Deborah, the mother, arises in Israel. And so just the way that they describe her feels really significant. But then this in particular, I wanted to point out the way that they sing about Jael. So she tempts Sisera with a bowl of milk. He comes and he falls asleep, and then she kills him in the tent, and the battle is over. But what I noticed was right here. She struck Sisera and crushed his head. A couple weeks back, we looked at Genesis. Genesis 3:15, that talks about the snake and the woman. The snake, for tempting Adam and Eve in the garden, is cursed among all other animals to crawl on his belly. But then God says, the seed of the woman will arise. He will crush the head of the snake. He will crush your head, but the snake will bite its heel. And I feel like this is interesting, because we looked back then that there's a reason why there's so many genealogies in the Old Testament, because it keeps this question alive. Is that new person, is he the snake crusher, right? Someone born of a woman will be the snake crusher. One day the snake crusher will come. And I don't think that this passage is saying it's finally happened, that Jael was the snake crusher, but this language seems really specific. The way that they sing about Jael is that she was the snake crusher. She crushed his head, the enemy. And so even, at least in part, I think they're making this theological point that here is an example of the snake crusher. And so Jael gets lifted up, blessed above all women, and her example is almost set forth as a way of recalling that ancient promise. From the very beginning, God has promised that from the seed of the woman will come someone who will crush the head of our enemy. And then you have Jael, who is emulating that in a very direct way. And they even use the same phrase of crushing his head. So I don't think they're saying that Jael was the Messiah or anything like that. I think we're still waiting at this point for the full fulfillment of the Genesis 3:15 prophecy. But it's interesting to think about Jael being described in that same way. So here you have two examples of women both leading Israel and saving Israel, even fulfilling, at least in part, some of the ancient prophecies about the one who would come to destroy the enemy. And you don't have anyone questioning that fact. The reality or the fact of their sex and gender really has nothing to do with the story. Nobody is questioning it. Barak doesn't seem to be bothered by that at all. And yet, while it's rare, to be sure, we're dealing with an ancient culture where it would have been incredibly rare for women like Deborah to rise up. And yet when they did, when God called them, there didn't seem to be any problem there. And Deborah is a high moment, especially if we're trying to look through Scripture and see what are some of the ways that God uses women alongside men for his purposes.